I found a small hunting lodge in the woods by searching on Google. That summer, my friends Dennis and Alex and I decided to have a little mail company. For this purpose, I rented this wonderful place. Waking up early in the morning, we packed our things, food, drinks, and went to this hunting lodge. The road was long. Dennis and Alex decided to take a nap, and I got behind the wheel. After a few hours of driving, I got on the road that led directly to our lodge. The road was terrible, covered with potholes, so the boys woke up from the shaking. We immediately started talking about what kind of animals live in this forest and how safe it is to rest in such places. I joined the dialogue and said that I would be very happy if I were lucky enough to photograph a wild wolf in the forest. I'm a photographer and run my own photo page on Facebook. After driving another 40 kilometers, we began to doubt whether we had taken the right turn. Taking out a map, we made sure we were going in the right direction and that there was a gas station in 5 kilometers. After a few more kilometers, we saw a billboard with the words, Nicholas Pub. It was already 17:48 hours on the clock, so we decided to stop and have a snack. We stopped at this place. Dennis and Alex were surprised that instead of a guard dog, there was a real wild wolf on a chain. The boys walked past the beast, and we went inside. I took out my camera and decided to take a picture of the pub and the wolf sitting on the chain. Took a few pictures, then decided to come a little closer. I took more pictures, and in the last shot, the wolf looked directly into the lens. Its eyes were strange and kind, and its gaze resembled that of a human. Having gained courage, I decided to come closer to the beast and greeted it with my hand. The beast abruptly jumped up and rushed at me, its jaws snapping right next to my face. The chain provided me with the last few millimeters. I fell on my ass, at which time Dennis opened the door to call me and asked what happened. "Nothing, this pack leader scared me a bit," I joked. We went inside and sat down at an empty table. The air in the room was permeated with the smell of fried meat, cigarettes, and God knows what else. Sticky fly tapes were hanging from the ceiling, the last ones I'd seen in my childhood. A waitress approached us with a leisurely gait, her lips thickly smeared with bright lipstick, moving sluggishly in sync with her buttocks, which were barely hidden by a miniskirt, which the guys paid attention to. Without taking the chewing gum out of her mouth, she asked, "Are you here to eat or to stare?" "3 business lunches, please," I answered, confused, not expecting such an onslaught. We weren't alone in the pub. A very strange, elderly woman sat across the table from us. After arguing with each other, we decided that she looked like a real witch. She was wearing a black hoodie, all eaten up by moths, and had warts on her hands. Her left eye was glassy. She noticed that I was looking at her, turned toward our table, and started laughing slyly. With her hand, she pulled out her glass eye and started licking it, continuing to laugh and looking in our direction. Alex took my camera and shouted, "Smile, beautiful!" and took her picture. Instantly, her facial expressions and face changed. She began to grind her teeth and clenched her fists. I saw blood flowing from her hands. Holy shit, I thought. Then she got up and staggered over to our table, took out her glass eye and threw it on our table. The eye broke into small pieces. I looked into her real eye and it was bleeding with rage. "This is your day of judgment, sinners!" We were numb with horror. We sat at the table like that for several minutes. Each of us had different thoughts in our heads. We were thinking about the evil eye or curse that might be upon us from now on. When I left the diner, I looked up at the sky and saw dark clouds and lightning. The wolf, sitting on the chain, began to howl. I immediately remembered what my grandmother had told me. Wolves howl only for the dead. Getting behind the wheel, we drove on, trying to forget this terrible episode. We drove in complete silence for 15 minutes. Each of us was immersed in our own thoughts. Suddenly, it started to rain with a thunderstorm. I tried to find at least one radio station to somehow distract myself from the terrible thoughts. We found a weak signal in the area. It worked just barely. As we were already deep in the forest and the connection was poor, clouds covered the sky and it became very dark. I turned on the headlights, glanced over to the back seat of the car, and saw that Alex and Dennis had fallen asleep again. The voice of the one-eyed witch came through the radio interference from the speaker. "This is your day of judgment, sinners." I slammed on the brake. Alex, Dennis, and you slammed into the front seat of the car. "What the hell are you doing?" Alex shouted at me. "Look ahead." I answered him with a trembling voice. The boys looked forward in synchronization. We all could not believe our eyes. On the road stood the same one-eyed old woman who had been in the pub. How could she get here so quickly? I got out of the car and said, "Please forgive us for that stupid incident that happened in the pub." She looked at me with surprised eyes and walked away while laughing terribly. I stood there, not moving, afraid to even move my tongue. The old hag came close, looked closely into my eyes, and suddenly hit me in the face with her hand. The blow was so hard that I fell to the asphalt. Alex was watching from the car. They jumped out of the car. Dennis went to pick me up, and Alex, unable to restrain himself, shouted at the old woman, "What's wrong with you, you damned witch?" When she heard this, she stopped abruptly, looked back at him, looked into his terrifying eyes, and then laughed like a madwoman. "Stop laughing, you crazy old woman! You could have killed my friend," added Alex. Her face changed again, just like in that hut. I realized that we should expect trouble. Her eye began to fill with blood. She opened her black mouth, and then earth wasps began to fly out of it. There was a whole swarm of them, maybe more, and the insects were all over Alex. He was screaming and calling for help. I could not believe my eyes. She covered her mouth, held her head up, and started laughing even louder. My friend fell to the ground and did not move. I realized he was dead. Dennis and I ran to the car and locked ourselves in. We started to panic. "How is this even possible?" I asked. Then I started looking for the old woman, peering through the windows, but she had disappeared. My heart was beating like crazy. Dennis started looking in his bag for a phone to call 911. I reached for the key to drive out of here. Suddenly, that hag reappeared in front of the car, holding a bloody hand. She was holding the car keys, waving them and laughing ominously. "What are we going to do, Dan?" I asked. He looked to the side, warm tears streaming from his eyes, and then I saw his face begin to melt. "Your face, Dan." I could not contain my horror. Dennis touched his face with his hand, and it stuck to his palm. In a panic, he began to grab his nose, lips, and cheeks. His skin began to stretch like rubber. I looked at him and could not hold back my tears because I realized that we were going to die painfully. Dennis's mouth started foaming. In a hoarse but audible voice, he said, "Help me." And then his heart stopped. I turned to the back seat and screamed. There was an old witch sitting there. I froze. My arms and legs felt like they were giving out. I could not move. The ice touched me. My eyes started to go dark and I fainted. I woke up in the morning near the same damned hut. My head was spinning. Every part of my body ached. There were already 3 wolves on a chain at the entrance. I walked past them and went inside. An old witch was sitting at the same table. She looked at me and laughed out loud. This story was told to me by a girl I know who happened to her and her mother when she was very young. She is telling it to you with her permission, but the name of the main character has been changed at the author's request. So let's imagine that her name was Elena. When she was a child, Elena lived in the city, and on vacations she went to her grandmother's house in a village near Poltava. She loved her grandmother to pieces. She baked delicious pies, gave her steamed milk, told her fairy tales in the evenings, and braided her hair with ribbons. This love was strong and mutual. Her grandmother allowed Elena to do almost anything, to climb on her head and dance. There was only one strict prohibition, not to go beyond the blind part of the house, which borders on the neighbor's land through a fence. The neighbor, a lonely elderly woman, was wrinkled and hunched over, always wearing dark clothes and unpleasant. Only the cat talked to her, and her loneliness to communicate with this old lady as well. A ban was imposed in principle, but what a child needs is strictly forbidden. Either curiosity or a child's passion for mischief got the better of her. Sneaking away from her grandmother, Elena snuck behind the house and peered through a gap in the fence. There she saw a mysterious neighbor and began to watch her. The old woman was limping around her yard, talking to her cat and hanging some herbs on a rope, and the girl's skin tingled, and suddenly her grandmother froze. She began to eagerly inhale the air with her nose, sniffing. Then she stopped abruptly, smiled to herself, and winked at the cat. Suddenly, he jumped on the fence above Elena's head and howled like crazy. The frightened girl ran back to the house, confused, and ran.
The next day, she ventured outside to play in the sandbox, and just as she was getting carried away, she felt something behind her. She looked back sharply, and it was the same neighbor standing by the sandbox. The old woman held out an apple. She was afraid to take it, but it was a very beautiful apple, red and shiny. The little girl could not resist and took it. The old woman smiled and said to herself something like, "Eat, child, eat. Like apples, you eat the beauty and freshness. Yes, I love you." And then Elena's memories, fragmentary, remembering how her grandmother applied compresses, remembering her mother, who came from the city. She remembers the doctor shrugging his shoulders, saying it was sunstroke or poisoning. On the third day, they barely got Elena to tell them what she ate besides her grandmother's food. The girl admitted that a neighbor had given her a delicious apple. Hearing this, her grandmother quickly grabbed her granddaughter in her arms and ran to the local fortune teller on the other side of the village. She wasted no time in starting her rituals. First, whispering something, she bathed Elena in a basin, then began to inject her with a candle, shouting something to every corner of the house. "I think there was something else, but it's hard to remember now," says the author of the story. But the fact remains that the girl felt better and came to. Elena remembers the following. The whisperer ordered her grandmother to bring a chicken, then took a church candle and burned the feathers on the bird's wings with it, whispering something threatening. After completing this ritual, the fortune teller's chicken was set free. She put a bracelet woven from herbs on Elena's arm and told her not to take it off until it disintegrated from dryness. After that, the girl gradually came to her senses, and she saw her neighbor coming out of the woods a few weeks later with her hands rewound. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. Elena fainted from sunstroke, and the neighbor burned herself with boiling water. Or perhaps she was dealing with real mysticism. But Elena did not go outside the house until she turned 30 and her neighbor died. By the way, after the neighbor's death, the cat guarded the house for another 5 years, and then disappeared and the house began to fall down.